Jane of Lantern Hill, Chapter 15. House hunting, Jane decided, was jolly. Perhaps it was really more the pleasure of the driving and talking and being silent with Dad that was jolly, for most of the houses on Dad's list were not interesting. The first house they looked at was too big. The second was too small. After all, we must have room to swing a cat, said Dad. Have you a cat? Demanded Jane. No, but we can get one if you like. I hear the kitten crop is tops this year. Do you like cats? Yes. Then we'll have a bushel of them. No, said Jane, 2. And a dog. I don't know how you feel about dogs, Jane, but if you're going to have a cat, I must have a dog. I haven't had a dog since... He stopped short again, and again Jane had the feeling that he'd been just on the point of saying something she wanted very much to hear. The third house looked attractive. It was just at the turn of a wooded road dappled with sunshine through the trees. But on inspection it proved hopeless. The floors were cut and warped and slanted in all directions. The doors didn't hang right. The windows wouldn't open. There was no pantry. There was too much gingerbread about the fourth house, Dad said, and neither of them looked twice at the fifth. A dingy, square, unpainted building with a litter of rusty cans, old pails, fruit baskets, rags and rubbish all over its garden. The next on my list is the old Jones house, said Dad. It was not so easy to find the old Jones house. The new Jones house fronted the road boldly, but you had to go past it and away down a deep-rutted, neglected lane to find the old one. You could see the gulf from the kitchen window. But it was too big, and both Dad and Jane felt that the view of the back of the Jones barns and pigsty was not inspiring. So they bounced up the lane again, feeling a little dashed. The seventh house seemed to be all a house should be. It was a small bungalow, new and white, with a red roof and dormer windows. The garden was trim, though treeless. There was a pantry and a nice cellar and good floors, and it had a wonderful view of the Gulf. Dad looked at Jane. Do you sense any magic about this, my Jane? Do you? Challenged Jane. Dad shook his head. Absolutely none. And as magic is indispensable, no can do. They drove away, leaving the man who owned the house wondering who them 2 lunatics were. What on earth was magic? He must see the carpenter who had built the house and find out why he hadn't put any in. 2 more houses were impossible. I suppose we're a pair of fools, Jane. We've looked at all the houses I've heard of that are for sale, and what's to be done now? Go back and eat our words and buy the bungalow? Let's ask this man who's coming along the road if he knows of any house we haven't seen, said Jane composedly. The Jimmy Johns have one, I hear, said the man. Over at Lantern Hill. The house that Aunt Matilda Jolly lived in. There's some of her furniture in it too, I hear. You'd likely get it reasonable if you jewed them down a bit. It's 2 miles to Lantern Hill, and you go by Queen's Shore. The Jimmy Johns and a Lantern Hill and an Aunt Matilda Jolly. Jane's thumbs pricked. Magic was in the offing. Jane saw the house first. At least, she saw the upstairs window in its gable end winking at her over the top of a hill. But they had to drive round the hill and up a winding lane between 2 dykes, with little ferns growing out of the stones and young spruces starting up along them at intervals. And then, right before them, was the house. Their house. Dear, don't let your eyes pop quite out of your head, warned Dad. It squatted right against a little steep hill, whose toes were lost in bracken. It was small. You could have put 6 of it inside 60 gay. It had a garden with a stone dyke at the lower end of it to keep it from sliding down the hill, a paling, a gate with 2 tall white birches leaning over it, and a flat-stoned walk up to the only door, which had 8 small panes of glass in its upper half. The door was locked, but they could see in it the windows. There was a good-sized room on one side of the door, stairs going up right in front of it, and 2 small rooms on the other side, whose windows looked right into the side of the hill, where ferns grew as high as your waist, and there were stones lying about covered with velvety green moss. There was a bandy-legged old stove in the kitchen, a table and some chairs, and a dear little glass-paned cupboard in the corner fastened with a wooden button. On one side of the house was a clover field, and on the other a maple grove sprinkled with firs and spruces, and separated from the house lot by an old lichen-covered board fence. There was an apple tree in the corner of the yard with pink petals falling softly, and a clump of old spruces outside the garden gate. "I like the pattern of this place," said Jane. "Do you suppose it's possible that the view goes with the house?" said Dad. Jane had been so taken up with her house that she had not looked at the view at all. Now she turned her eyes on it and lost her breath over it. Never, never had she seen or even dreamed of anything so wonderful. Lantern Hill was at the apex of a triangle of land, which had the Gulf for its base and Queen's Harbour for one of its sides. There were silver and lilac sand dunes between them and the sea, extending into a bar across the harbour, where great splendid blue and white waves were racing to the long sun-washed shore. Across the channel, a white lighthouse stood up against the sky, and on the other side of the harbour were the shadowy crests of purple hills that dreamed with their arms around each other. And over it all, the indefinable charm of a Prince Edward Island landscape. Just below Lantern Hill, skirted by spruce barrens on the harbour side and a pasture field on the other, was a little pond, absolutely the bluest thing Jane had ever seen. "Now that is my idea of a pond," said Dad. Jane said nothing at first. She could only look. She had never been there before, but it seemed as if she had known it all her life. The song the sea wind was singing was music native to her ears. She had always wanted to belong somewhere, and she belonged here. At last she had a feeling of home. "Well, what about it?" said Dad. Jane was so sure the house was listening that she shook her finger at him. "Shh, shh," she said. "Let's go down to the shore and talk it over," said Dad. It was about 15 minutes' walk to the outside shore. They sat down on the bone-white body of an old tree that had drifted from heaven knew where. The snapping, salty breeze whipped their faces, the surf creamed along the shore, the wee sand peeps flitted fearlessly past them. "How clean salt air is," thought Jane. "Jane, I have a suspicion that the old roof leaks. You can put some shingles on it. There are a lot of burdocks in the yard. We can root them out. The house may have once been white, but it can be white again. The paint on the front door is blistered. Paint doesn't cost very much, does it? The shutters are broken. Let's fix them. The plaster is cracked. We can paper over it. Who knows if there's a pantry, Jane? There are shelves in one of the little rooms on the right. I can use that for a pantry. The other little room would do you for a study. You'd have to have some place to write, wouldn't you?" "She's got it all planned out," Dad told the Atlantic, but added, "That big maple wood is a likely place for owls." "Who's afraid of owls?" "And what about magic, my Jane?" "Magic? Why, the place was simply jammed with magic. You were falling over magic." Dad knew that. He was only talking for the sake of talking. When they went back, Jane sat down on the big red sandstone slab which served as a doorstep, while Dad went through the maple wood by a little twisted path the cows had made to see Jimmy John, otherwise Mr. J. Garland. The Garland house could be seen peeping round the corner of the maples, a snug butter-coloured farmhouse decently dressed in trees. Dad came back with Jimmy John, a little fat man with twinkling grey eyes. He hadn't been able to find the key, but they had seen the ground floor, and he told them there were 3 rooms upstairs with a spool bed in one of them and a cupboard in each of them, and a bookshelf under the stairs. They stood on the stone walk and looked at the house. "What are you going to do with me?" said the house, as plainly as a house ever spoke. "What is your price?" said Dad. 400, with the furniture thrown in for good measure, said Jimmy John, winking at Jane. Jane winked rakishly back. After all, grandmother was nearly 1,000 miles away. "Bango, saxpence," said Dad. He did not try to Jew Jimmy John down. That he could buy all this loveliness for $400 was enough. Dad handed over $50 and said the rest would be paid the next day. "The house is yours," said Jimmy John, with an air of making them a present of it. But Jane knew the house had always been theirs. "The house and the pond and the harbour and the gulf. A good-bye," said Dad. "And half an acre of land. All my life I've wanted to own a little bit of land, just enough to stand on and say, 'This is mine.' And now, Jane, it's brillig." 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Jane knew her Alice too well to be caught tripping on that. Just as they were leaving, a pocket edition of Jimmy John, with an impudent little face, came tearing through the maple grove with the key which had turned up in his father's absence. Jimmy John handed it to Jane with a bow. Jane clutched it tightly all the way back to Brookview. She loved it. Think what it would open for her. They discovered they were hungry, having forgotten all about dinner, so they fished out Mrs. Mead's butter cookies and ate them. "You'll let me do the cooking, Dad?" "Why, you'll have to. I can't." Jane glowed. "I wish we could move in tomorrow, Dad." "Why not? I can get some bedding and some food. We can go on from there." "I just can't bear to have this day go," said Jane. "It doesn't seem as if there could ever be another so happy." "We've got tomorrow, Jane. Let me see, we've got about 95 tomorrows. 95, gloated Jane. "And we'll do just as we want to inside of decency. We'll be clean, but not too clean. We'll be lazy, but not too lazy. Just do enough to keep 3 jumps ahead of the wolf. And we'll never have in our house that devilish thing known as an intermittent alarm clock." "But we must have some kind of clock," said Jane. "Timothy Salt, down at the harbour mouth, has an old ship's clock. I'll get him to lend it to us. It only goes when it feels like it, but what matter? Can you darn my socks, Jane?" "Yes," said Jane, who had never darned a sock in her life. "Jane, we're sitting on top of the world. It was a piece of amazing luck you're asking that man, Jane." "It wasn't luck. I knew he'd know," said Jane. "And oh, Dad, can we keep the house a secret till we've moved in?" "Of course," agreed Dad. "From everyone except Aunt Irene. We'll have to tell her, of course." Jane said nothing. She had not known till Dad spoke that it was really from Aunt Irene that she wished to keep it secret. Jane didn't believe she would sleep that night. How could one go to sleep with so many wonderful things to think of? And some that were very puzzling. How could 2 people like Mother and Dad hate each other? It didn't make sense. They were both so lovely in different ways. They must have loved each other once. What had changed them? If she, Jane, only knew the whole truth, perhaps she could do something about it. But as she drifted off into dreams of spruce-shadowed red roads that all led to dear little houses, her last conscious thought was, "I wonder if we can get our milk at the Jimmy John's."